Hello and welcome to Protect Ukraine Now YouTube channel. Last week, the Senate followed the House and also voted for foreign aid bills that President Biden later signed into law. This is a big win for Ukraine, and without any doubt, the credit for the achievement goes to all Ukraine supporters who have made daily phone calls, wrote letters to their members of the Congress, traveled to Washington, D.C. to meet them in person, and otherwise advocated for Ukraine. Without all this effort, the aid to Ukraine would have come to an end with all the corresponding consequences. This achievement is a testimony to what political advocacy can accomplish with enough people taking part in standing for their values and beliefs. Right now, I would like to take some time to go over what we have accomplished. I will not be praising or criticizing this document. That was relevant in the past when there was an opportunity to amend it for better. When that window of opportunity was still open, we talked on this channel about ways to improve this legislation. We hoped to get enough advocacy effort to make a difference. Since that ship has sailed, this video is a quick overview of HR 835, which is the 2024 supplemental bill for Ukraine we ended up with. I'm going to show you where the 61 billion amount actually comes from. I will also touch on why I believe going over the details in this bill is important and why I believe this topic is worth a half an hour of your time. I realize that going over a legal document and looking at numerous dollar amounts is not exactly fun, and I will try to make it as concise as possible. So please bear with me. You are looking at the actual text of the bill. As you can see, this is a 49-page document, released as it is evident by a timestamp in the lower left corner on April 17, 2024. This is the latest and final version of the bill that President Biden signed into law. To make this document easier to understand, my team and I went through all dollar amounts in this document, all 59 of them, and we copied them along with a description into a Google spreadsheet. We also took note of the page and row of a specific dollar amount came from. So, for example, on page 2, row 6, we find $207,158,000. And the text around it reads, for an additional amount for military personnel army, $207,158,000 to remain available until December 31st, 2024 to respond to the situation in Ukraine and for related expenses. Pay attention to this definition to respond to the situation in Ukraine and for related expenses. This definition is attached to most line items in this bill, and it tells us Ukraine is not directly the beneficiary of this appropriation. In this example, the money is allocated for the Department of Defense and is meant for the military personnel army. And these funds need to be used to respond to the situation in Ukraine. So in our spreadsheet, we will enter this as military personnel army, valid through end of December 2024. We're going to list the amount, $207,158,000. We're going to know the page and the row number this amount came from. We're also going to mark it as not for Ukraine, however, to respond to the situation in Ukraine, as is evident from the description. Again, let me be clear. I'm not suggesting these expenses are unnecessary or Ukraine cannot at all benefit from them. I'm simply pointing out the intended recipient of the fund, which is, in this case, the Department of Defense. In this document, we have highlighted with yellow line items that actually for Ukraine. So let's look at how they are listed in the bill document. We're going to look at Ukraine Security Assistance Initiative, USAI. In our spreadsheet, this amount is listed on page 5, row 12. So we're going to go to that page, row 12, and we find 13,772,460,000. And we can see that the total amount provided under this heading in this act, 13,772,460,000 to remain available until September 30, 2025, shall be for the Ukraine security assistance. So this money is for this program and not to respond to the situation in Ukraine. Let's look at another line item that we know is indeed for Ukraine, that this time we're going to look at economic support funds for assistance for Ukraine. And again, this is going to be on page 22, row 9. And we're going to read from the bill. For an additional amount for economic support fund, $7,899,000,000 to remain available until September 30, 2025, provided that of the total amount provided under this heading in this act, $7,849,000,000 shall be for assistance for Ukraine, which may include budget support and which may made available and so on. Now, as we can see, this assistance is for Ukraine. We are very specific in the description that this money is going to Ukraine. It's not to respond to the situation in Ukraine. This is for Ukraine. So this is how we tell apart items that are for Ukraine and to respond to a situation in Ukraine and for related expenses. I hope we're clear about it. You can follow the rest of the line items on this bill on your own. We're not going to go through all of them. The link to this document is in the description to this video. However, there are a few things on this document that require additional comments and discussion. First, let's look at FMF assistance. This is a short-term military aid for Ukraine. If we look at the description, this fund is assistance for Ukraine and countries impacted by the situation in Ukraine. So this amount, $1.6 billion, is for Ukraine. However, it seemed to be also shared by other countries. We don't know how this amount is going to split. If it may be mostly used for Ukraine, it may have a significant portion go to other countries impacted by the situation in Ukraine. We do not know how much of that money is actual for Ukraine. However, for the sake of simplicity, we marked the entire amount as for Ukraine. So this is absolute maximum that Ukraine will receive under this program. Realistically, it could be less. Second number over here that requires explanation is PDA. As we have discussed in the past, PDA is Presidential Drawdown Authority, meaning the president is allowed to use up to the amount specified in the law to assist other countries. The Presidential Drawdown Authority, as it is specified in Foreign Assistance Act of 1961, belongs to the president. That means that no matter how many countries need to be helped in a particular fiscal year, in our case, this is a year 2024, the cap is still set to $7.8 billion. We know that in addition to Ukraine, there are other PDA funds allocated this year, namely for Israel and Taiwan. So Ukraine is getting under PDA reimbursement in the amount of $13.4 billion. To be entirely correct, this money goes to the Department of Defense to replenish their stock. So $13.4 billion were allocated for Ukraine. We also know that there were $4.4 billion allocated for Israel and $1.9 allocated for Taiwan. These two dollar amounts are listed in other bills for Ukraine and for Israel. However, we need to keep them in mind when we assume how much money out of $7.8 billion Ukraine can expect this year. So we took a proportion of all reimbursement funds back to the Department of Defense, and we assumed that if money is going to be spent proportionally between all three countries, Ukraine can count on about $5.3 billion this year. Also, let's talk about the $61 billion for Ukraine. Every news outlet has reported that supplemental aid with $61 billion for Ukraine passed both chambers of the Congress and is signed into law. Awesome. But where is this number and how is it calculated? If we look at the totals over here, we can see that total appropriated for Ukraine is about $28.9 billion. Total to respond to the situation in Ukraine is $64.7 billion. And the total amount of appropriations under HR 835 is $89.2 billion. Please know that we can't just add money for Ukraine and other appropriations because of how PDA is calculated. Ukraine is getting about $5.3 billion in PDA authority, and Department of Defense is getting $13.4 billion to respond to the situation in Ukraine and get reimbursed for their expenditures. This makes our calculations more complicated than a straightforward algebra. So why is the bill for Ukraine is labeled 61 and not $89 billion? We played around to figure out how this number, $61 billion, was calculated, and we added X next to each line item we believe should be included in the calculation. So this formula down below is looking for that X to calculate the amount listed in their column E in the $61 billion that we're trying to come up with. So as you can see, we have put X next to each and every line item over here that is to respond to the situation in Ukraine or for Ukraine. So both Ukraine allocated funds and funds allocated to respond to the situation are used in the $61 billion calculation, all of them except this line item, operation and maintenance defense-wide, $27.9 billion. If we look at the text of the bill, we're going to see that this line is no different than all others labeled with to respond to the situation in Ukraine and for related expenses. So the bill text doesn't explain why this line item was left out, and we can only guess that $89 billion for Ukraine is too much of a spin. Also, 61 billion is much closer to their previous year appropriations. Let me remind you that in the year 2022 and 2023, Ukraine was appropriated 114 billion in aid. 61 billion is not quite a half of that amount, but much closer than $89 billion. In any event, $61 billion for Ukraine is a made-up number, and it does not represent the real appropriations for Ukraine, which is 28.9 billion, or total appropriations in HR 8035, which is $89 billion. Okay, let's look at this chart on the overview tab of the Google spreadsheet. I'm going to be sharing the link to this Google document in the description to this video, so you can review all of this information on your own. Again, let's look at the rough categories in this supplemental for Ukraine. It is labeled for Ukraine. However, as we can see, Ukraine is only going to be getting about 32.3% of the total allocations. The largest beneficiary of this supplemental is the US military, that will be getting 62% of the entire bill. And there will also be some allocations to other programs not related to helping Ukraine. Okay, so now let's talk about why all of these numbers matter, and this discussion is totally worth your time. First of all, truth matters. 61 billion is not just a number. It's a measure of the quality of the aid the US provides to Ukraine. This is not a single measure, but I hope everyone agrees that there is a direct relationship between the quality of the overall assistance and the funds allocated for it. So naturally, people who administer the aid would like this number to be as big as possible so they can take credit for assisting Ukraine to a greater extent. The position of the Protect Ukraine Now team is that our government deserves credit for the assistance they have actually provided, not any more and not any less. Before you, as an American, judge the quality of the Ukraine aid, you need to know what it actually is. Without knowing what's inside of the box, your reaction, that is gratitude or disappointment, is for the intention and not for the action. Imagine a friend or relative approaches you with a, "Hey, I got something for you." What do you immediately feel? Gratitude. You don't know yet what you are getting and how much value it has for you, but you are already grateful for the intention, because the intention is good and you also hope that you are getting something worse to be excited about. The same thing happens when most Ukraine supporters think about the US aid for Ukraine. The intention projected by the government overall is positive, and the actual aid value is highly obscure. There are obviously people who keep track of the actual numbers. However, from my experience, even the most outspoken Ukraine supporters fall under the category of people I just described. This situation creates a sizable perception gap between the aid promised and the aid Ukraine has actually received or has a chance to receive in the foreseeable future. The intention of this video is to close this perception gap, because we believe people need to know the truth in order to make sound decisions. Now, in order for our own intention here to have significant value, we need your help, and there are two things you can do for us. All links to the data in this video can be found in the description section. If you believe our calculations are wrong, please leave a comment on this video and tell us where we are mistaken. If we made a mistake, we would like to know about it so we can correct it. If you agree with our analytics and conclusion, please share this video with your friends and family so we can reach a broader audience. So truth matters, and so matter lies. Russian propaganda, and for that matter, the Russian Federation itself, are built on lies, and they are using it as a tool. They are happy to associate the elevated numbers with Ukraine in order to further fuel the opposition here in the United States. Very soon, you're going to hear about Ukraine getting another 60 billion on top of 114 billion from the previous appropriations. You are going to hear about how this money is wasted. You're going to hear that the war still continues despite all the money spent, and Ukraine is not able to win. There are other ways Ukraine opposition could spin this, but in any event, they're going to use these elevated aid numbers against Ukraine. This also matters for advocacy. The bill for Ukraine has passed both chambers of the Congress and is signed into the law by President. Is this it? Of course not. As we have just seen, this bill only allocates funds to a specific cause. There is still a lot of work that needs to be done. All further advocacy this year is going to be about using these resources in the most efficient way. In order to advocate for specific capabilities Ukraine requires, we need to have a clear understanding of what resources we have available. Finally, there are many people out there who believe this supplemental package for Ukraine is the last one this year. For example, Eugene Windman, who is a vocal supporter of Ukraine and attended the Ukraine Action Summit a few weeks ago as a guest speaker, certainly believes so. I asked for his opinion on the insufficient aid for Ukraine proposed in the current bill, and he told me that basically it is what it is, and Ukraine would need to stretch it until the next year. At the same time, I believe as we get closer to the elections, there could be opportunities to pass through another aid package for Ukraine. For this to happen, there must be enough advocates for Ukraine here in the United States who understand the gravity of the situation and a strong need for requesting more assistance. This is only possible if people understand exactly how much aid Ukraine can count on for the year to come. In conclusion, this is great. The bill for Ukraine has passed. Our next priority is advocating for the right kind of aid to be delivered quickly and efficiently. Please stay tuned. Our next video is going to be about Ukraine advocacy priorities. Meanwhile, thank you for watching this video. Please share it with your friends and family if you find this content interesting and important. Thank you.